War breeds horror, both of the physical variety and the metaphysical. In the course of their valiant service, many soldiers have reported mysterious experiences, including alleged encounters with ghosts and spirits. In 2009, the Times reported on Military Observation Point Rock in the Helmand province of Afghanistan, stating that, according to the American soldiers of the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines, it is incredibly haunted. In fact, the rock was reputed to be so paranormally active that it was commonly known as the Haunted Observation Point. According to the war correspondent who reported on the happenings, the story began when Marines stationed at the rock reported finding a bone in a shallow trench, a bone that had clearly once been a part of a human leg. This grisly discovery was followed by the unearthing of many other human bones. Soldiers reburied most of them, but then found bodies. Multiple graves were uncovered. In one of them, there was even said to be a skeleton still wearing a pair of glasses. In the aftermath of these unexpected discoveries, many peculiar paranormal happenings are said to have been experienced, and so, in an attempt to abate the spirits that were thought to be connected to the remains, the Marines reburied what they had found. When Marines from the battalion's Golf Company were reassigned, they told their successors from Fox Company to be wary. As Sergeant Josh Brown explained to the new soldiers, the local people say this is a cursed place. Aside from the bones and the paranormal happenings connected to them, Brown emphasized other inexplicable occurrences that he had experienced during his time at the Rock. With certainty, he told the new soldiers that they would see weird lights up here at night. And Brown was not alone. Other soldiers in the outgoing unit are reported as having said, "It is weird what you hear and don't hear at the Rock." Aside from strange sights and strange sounds, there were also strange smells. According to Corporal Herrera, the observation point often smelled like something was dying. And so, paranormal happenings were widely experienced and reported by soldiers at the Rock. One such personal testimony related by Corporal Jacob Lima describes how he was woken up one night by the sound of screaming. Another corporal called Zolik was yelling and begging for him to accompany him to the firing point he was guarding. Concerned, Lima followed him there and was told by Zolik that he had heard a voice whisper something in his ear that sounded like Russian. There was, however, no one there, least of all Russians. Another soldier called Dutch Perkins also reported hearing strange whispers in his ear that sounded like Russian, whilst he stood guard from midnight to dawn. He described the sound as faint at first, after which it escalated to the point where it felt as though someone was standing post with him. Eerily, it is thought that Soviet soldiers were executed at the site when they were at war with Afghanistan in the 1980s. The hill on which the observation point sits has a strange history that is not entirely understood, even long before the arrival of Soviet soldiers. Before the rock was occupied by US forces, Marines deployed demolition charges, believing it to be an enemy defensive position. Before doing so, Lance Corporal Brendan Kelly discovered a series of mysterious underground tunnels under the site. These tunnels led to a strange single chamber. Some have theorized that this chamber was once an ancient tomb, yet no one knows the full history of the location. And yet, with its medieval arrow slits and fortified turrets, it is clear that the rock used to serve as a mud fort. Locals even believe that the site dates back to the time of Alexander the Great, with Lance Corporal Austin Hoyt, who was stationed at the rock, having attested that if you stick a shovel in anywhere, you'll find bones and bits of pottery. Many people have perished at the site throughout its long history, many people who are thought to have stayed after death. And so, because of its strong connection with the afterlife, locals believe the rock and its surroundings are imbued with a mystical energy and may even be cursed. To do anything there is to risk supernatural consequence. One particularly dramatic incident in its history is said to have occurred in the 1980s, when a supposed miracle took place during a battle against the Soviets. One longtime resident of the area describes how several tanks went into the earth and disappeared. Others were simply abandoned in the aftermath of the battle. Years later, these tanks could still be seen, untouched. Local residents were simply too fearful to approach them, the area being too heavy, too haunted, and too full of dead bodies. Since the occupation by US forces and the subsequent unearthing of more human remains, the paranormal phenomena only intensified, with each successive military unit stationed at the Rock reporting paranormal happenings. A unit of the Welsh Guards, a regiment of the British Army, also reported strange phenomena when they were stationed there. Apparently, these soldiers reported seeing a lot of unexplained lights through night vision goggles. Some believed them to have been caused by spirits of the dead. And with death and war having plagued the area for centuries, it is perhaps unsurprising that these troubled souls would linger beyond the grave. RAF Wickenbee in Lincolnshire, England, was operational for a relatively short time, a purpose-built Royal Air Force station constructed between late 1942 and early 1943. It was closed a mere 13 years later, in 1956. Even so, during its service, RAF Wickenbee played a large part in the bomber offensive of the period, housing 12 and 626 squadrons, elite Lancaster flying bomber squadrons that took part in many of the major raids of the 1940s, including those against Berlin, Munich, Nuremberg and Cayenne. During the hostilities, over 300 operations were flown from the airfield, with 166 bombers reported missing. All in all, 1,080 lives were lost from the base. The tragedies witnessed by RAF Wickenbee left their mark, both on local residents and, if the stories are to be believed, on the very physical structure of the site, with it being claimed that the souls of those who died in service still linger at the airbase. All manner of phenomena have been reported at the site. Shadowy figures walking near the runway, people whistling old songs, spectral airmen smoking cigarettes before vanishing into thin air, mechanics running towards where old hangars used to be and disappearing mid-step. One of the most well-known ghost stories connected to the base, however, comes from a soldier by the name of Michael Benteen. Born in Hertfordshire in January 1922, Benteen worked for RAF intelligence and liaised with various Allied squadrons and groups, including the US 8th Air Force. Connected to a fighter-bomber unit, he took part in operations across Europe right until the end of the war. His role as an intelligence officer led him to Wickenbee, and it was there that he became good friends with Flight Lieutenant Arthur Walker. Affectionately known as Pop by those at the base, Walker was well respected, a 31-year-old senior navigator who, by December 1943, had just finished his tour of 30 operations and as such was to become an instructor. On Thursday, the 16th of December, Benteen was granted a 48-hour pass and spoke to his friend before leaving, wishing him well for the day. Later, when Benteen returned, he saw Walker as he made his way back to his Nissen hut barracks. Pleased to see him, Benteen cried out, "Hi, Pop." According to Benteen's account, Walker was about 35 feet away from him and, after giving a sign of acknowledgement, made his way to his own hut. The next morning, Benteen was devastated to discover that Walker had lost his life on returning from a raid on Berlin, in which he volunteered to help a new bomber crew. All on board perished. What Benteen had seen the previous evening was thus impossible, unless his beloved friend had, despite death, found a way to return to base to say goodnight to him one final time. The USS Hornet CV-12 is a legendary ship. An aircraft carrier launched in 1943, the Hornet participated in attacks in the Pacific Theater until being badly damaged by a typhoon and returning to the United States for repairs. After the war, the carrier continued to serve, returning to the Pacific for the Vietnam War twice. Later, the ship was even chosen to recover the Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 astronauts as they returned from the moon. Eventually decommissioned in 1970, the Hornet was opened to the public in 1998 as a museum in California. And so the USS Hornet's legendary status was preserved, not merely as a highly decorated aircraft carrier, but also as quite possibly the most haunted military ship in the world. In 27 years of active service, more than 300 people lost their lives aboard. The majority perished in combat, with others being lost due to horrendous shipboard accidents. For decades, those who have served on the ship, and indeed those who have visited in the time since it has become a museum, have whispered that the dead remain on board, continuing their duties in spectral form. A story of one such ghostly encounter comes from a man named Dan Brisker, who claims to have been aboard the Hornet from 1965 through March of 1969. According to his testimony, shared to a webpage dedicated to the USS Hornet, he came aboard as a machinist's mate striker, but was soon assigned to number 3 fire room. There, the machinery was loud, with those who served in such spaces quickly becoming accustomed to the constant noise. Cold iron, when the machinery was shut down, was, according to Brisker, the time that was the strangest. It was during this downtime when no machinery is running that you hear all the squeaks, creaks, bumps, thuds, moans, groans, and assorted sounds in that space. Whilst the sounds may have been scary to an outsider, they were normal to Brisker. The machinery space when shut down was undeniably eerie, with it being normal to occasionally have the feeling that you were being watched, hear muffled voices, or even out of the corner of your eye get a glimpse of someone walking to the back of the boiler, only to find no one there. Brisker knew it was all normal. Regardless, in order to make it through the watch, it was often necessary for him to remind himself that it was just his mind playing tricks. Even so, there was one experience when Brisker had a cold iron watch in a different fire room from his usual domain that he could not explain away. According to his testimony, repairs were being made in number 2 fire room, and the space was in disarray, with deck plates up and the boiler front open. And so he started his lonely watch, passing the time the best he was able, a little reading, a little singing, a dance move or two, anything to get through the watch. Eventually the hunger pains started, and Brisker hurried to retrieve some snacks he had stashed in his locker. He was away for no more than 5 minutes, and when he returned he was surprised to find that someone was working in the boiler firebox. Sitting at the bottom of the ladder eating his snacks, he explained that he could hear them inside of the firebox. After about 10 to 15 minutes they had not emerged, and so Brisker walked over to let them know he was outside. Within about 2 feet of the boiler, he heard the sound of a paint scraper drop to the firebox floor. Believing that whoever was inside had heard him approach, he said that he stuck his face through the opening. Supposedly, there in the middle of the firebox floor was the paint scraper, but missing was the person who was using it. There was no one there. Brisker was convinced that only seconds before he had heard someone working inside. He had no explanation for what he had experienced. Ending his testimony, all he could say was this: from that day on, the explanation "it must be my mind playing tricks" just didn't work for me anymore. And so, if Brisker's tale is to be believed, it seems that someone who once worked on the ship was continuing to do so, even beyond the grave. Similar is a story from a US Coast Guardsman who volunteered on the Hornet in February 2009. Whilst helping to paint one of the ship's compartments, he and his fellow volunteers were dressed in white paper suits. In need of more paint, he left the room in which they were working and went off in search of the Hornet worker who was supplying our paint. He soon got lost in the labyrinthian ship, wandering the passageways until he spotted one of his co-workers some 25 feet ahead of him, dressed in their white paper suit. He called out to them, but they kept walking, stepping into a side passageway. Supposedly, when the Coast Guardsman caught up with them, turning into the passageway, he was surprised to see no sign of his co-worker. Not only that, there was a chain blocking the entrance to the passageway, with it only leading to an empty compartment. When he eventually found his way back to his original compartment, he approached the co-worker he had seen and asked them what had happened. Why had they not turned when he had called? Where did they disappear to? The co-worker was confused. They claimed that they had not left the room for about an hour. What he thought he had seen was not possible. Later, when the Coast Guardsman mentioned his experience to the Hornet's employees, one lady supposedly told him that he had seen the Dress White's ghost, the apparition of a sailor who was well known to wander the passageways of the Hornet wearing his Dress White uniform. The Great War was fought between 1914 and 1918 and mobilized 70 million people for its cause. It was a war where people lost their individuality and became part of vast quantities of numbers that either perished or were never the same again. Amongst these numbers were individuals, some of whom had experienced that which went beyond the horrors of war and into the supernatural. In 1916, the Daily Express reported on a British colonel who was highly regarded amongst his men who fought in Flanders. One morning in the course of fighting, a hand grenade deprived him of an arm. He was taken back to England to be treated for his injuries, but wanted nothing more than to be returned to the front to be with his men. However, this was not to be. Command told him that he could not return to the Western Front. Thus, he was given command of a garrison battalion in the Mediterranean. Even so, his men back in Flanders never lost hope that they would see their colonel again, even after they found out about his reassignment. And yet, when the colonel arrived in Lemnos, upon landing he was one of the first to be afflicted with dysentery. A Red Cross ship took him back to England, and he was able to arrive at one of the Channel ports safely. Yet, on the train taking him to London, his affliction worsened, and he passed away. It is said that as the colonel lay dying on the train to London, his men in their trench in Flanders reported an extraordinary event. The men were going about their business when the company's sergeant major is said to have reported to the commander, "Here's the colonel coming round. I didn't know he was back again." Supposedly, the commanding officer then looked up and saw the colonel. His appearance is described in detail in the article of 1916. He was standing with his cap just a little to one side, as he always wore it. His field boots were caked with mud, and an old pair of binoculars were slung around his neck. As the officer approached the colonel to greet him, he dropped his stick, and so bent down to pick it up. When he looked up at the colonel, he was gone. There was no explaining it. Unaware that the colonel was dying, none of the men who saw him that day thought that they had seen a ghost. They had seen their colonel, full-bodied and alive. Immediately after the incident, the officer rushed down a communication trench and queried the officers there. "Did you see him?" he is said to have asked. One of the officers is reported as having explained that they all saw the colonel looking down the trench, clearly seeing him for a full minute, before all of a sudden he was not there anymore. They further attested to this apparition by stating that all the men saw him too, and yet there was a peculiarity. The colonel had both his arms. It was not until the following week, when the mail arrived, that the regiment learned of the colonel's death. The article goes on to claim that over 100 soldiers claimed to have seen the apparition of their beloved colonel come before them to say goodbye to them one last time. Camp Lejeune in North Carolina is a 246 square mile United States Marine Corps training base. Construction began in 1941, and since that time the base has helped to prepare thousands of soldiers for combat and humanitarian missions. And if the stories are to be believed, the camp has also been the site of many inexplicable, seemingly paranormal happenings. One of the most striking stories from the base was shared some 4 years ago by a serving staff sergeant in the Marine Corps. Posting their experience to the online military network platform RallyPoint, they explained how a series of strange things reported at Camp Lejeune led to an intervention by military command. It was 2013, and the soldier was on duty in Courthouse Bay when a few Marines were goofing around with a Ouija board. Supposedly, the board terrified the Marines to such an extent that they decided to burn it. Within the next week, all manner of inexplicable things were reported by others at the base. Screams were allegedly heard coming from the woods, and female Marines reported being woken in the middle of the night to find the door wide open and their underwear pulled down to their ankles. Objects were moved, everything from remote controls spinning seemingly of their own volition to chairs rolling around on their own. Many also reported hearing the voices of little girls in their rooms. According to the soldiers' testimony, the reports, wide-ranging, terrifying and disturbing, were taken very seriously, resulting in firewatch being doubled and a permanent sitting post being established in front of the female barracks rooms. Regardless, the same things were still reported. Not only that, doors were seen to open and even slam closed by themselves. Fear ripped through the camp. In fact, the disturbance generated in the aftermath of the Ouija board being burned was so bad that a commanding officer issued a standing order on the 18th of November 2013, explicitly banning the use of Ouija boards in/on Marine Corps Engineers school spaces, buildings or property. The staff sergeant shared images of this standing order as part of their original post, revealing the genuine concern that military command at the base had regarding the mystery and fear that the boards had created. They were contrary to good order and discipline, and as such anyone found using one would be subject to administrative action. The Marine who shared this unusual story did not elaborate to state whether or not the strange happenings at the camp ebbed away after this. However, they are far from alone in their assertion of strange reports being made by soldiers at Camp Lejeune. Another testimony, shared by someone who lived on the base with their family, described how plenty of weird stuff was happening in their house. Within a week of moving in, they supposedly experienced doors opening and closing by themselves, electrical malfunctions, including the washing machine turning on randomly, and even terrifying pounding noises on their walls. Most horrifying, however, was their claim that their young son was able to see something they could not. According to their testimony, the boy dead-eyed something on the far wall of his room, after which 2 screeching voices could be heard. The child is said to have immediately started crying, with his parents unable to explain what had happened or where the voices had come from. Ultimately, they were of the belief that a figure lurked in their house, and even claimed to have captured an image of said figure via their baby monitor, lurking in the closet in their master bedroom. As uniquely terrifying as this account is, it is not the only instance of hauntings being reported by soldiers and their families on the base with a connection to children and baby monitors. In October 2012, the official Camp Lejeune Facebook page posted a question of the week, asking if their followers had ever experienced paranormal activity at the base. The responses were overwhelming in number. Amongst them was a brief testimony from a lady by the name of Angel, who claimed to have had a man living in her house in the Midway Park military housing neighborhood. Her daughter, she explained, reported seeing the ethereal man several times, with she and her husband even catching sight of him once. According to her post, he would also try to communicate through the baby monitors and would open their garage door. Another responder to the same post claimed that their children would often report seeing strange shadows, with yet another person detailing how the daughter of a friend who lived on the base was known to talk to the spirit of a little girl, a spirit who was said to tell the daughter that she was choking. There are a ridiculous number of stories from Camp Lejeune, shared by soldiers and their families from all across the base. One relating to the 2nd Light Armoured Recon Battalion barracks describes how strange sounds frequently come from one of the rooms, and that at times it is supposedly possible to see a spectral woman's face looking out from one of the windows. Several other testimonies relate to Courthouse Bay, the subdivision of the camp where the 2013 Ouija board story originated. One such account, dating back to 1995, described how a Marine encountered a man wearing a ball cap and a light jacket fishing on the dock one night. It was a clear, moonlit evening, and the Marine, who was out for a stroll, walked to the dock and initiated cheerful conversation, asking the man if he had caught anything. He seemed as though he didn't want to be bothered, and so the Marine sat down on the dock and lit a cigarette. When he looked up, The man, so the Marine claimed, had vanished. According to his testimony, he later found out that a Marine had drowned whilst fishing drunk at the exact same spot in the 1970s, and that people have been seeing him there ever since. Arguably the most striking element of the accounts from the camp is the matter-of-fact way in which they are shared. Often the accounts are not embellished, but rather shared in a way that borders on mundanity, as if the soldiers are fully aware that their experiences are just one of many, and that nothing is truly out of the ordinary when you serve at Camp Lejeune. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Before I end, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who has purchased my documentary In Search of the Dead, both generally and more especially since my last video. I really hope you enjoyed watching it, and cannot thank you enough for supporting my work. I am humbled and very grateful. If you haven't yet seen my documentary and would like to do so, for the whole of this month, January, I am offering 25% off via Vimeo by using the promo code ISOTD21. The link is in the description. Thank you again. Until next time.